Good morning. I'm Sydney Remley. The news has been plagued by stories of police brutality against men of color, and recently, a rash of violence against Asian Americans. These stories must be told, but equally important are the stories of people of color who are still alive, their achievements and struggles in this country. Unfortunately, stories of murder and protest are all the coverage that people of color seem to receive in U.S. news. Women of color, in particular, have been underrepresented and stereotyped by the U.S. news media. Because of the potential for nuanced perspectives in journalism, the success of promising diversity programs, the possibility of change from the bottom up, and the importance of representation, United States newsrooms need to make an effort to hire more women of color. There is a history of stereotyping women of color in the United States media, which began with blatant racism and has evolved into media caricatures and unconscious bias. Some of these stereotypes codified in the 1930s and 40s, when, according to Brittany Terry's thesis on Black women in film, images of Black women appeared in Hollywood films depicted as the Mammy and Sapphire. Depictions of Black women in the United States media originate from the stereotypes created during American slavery and have evolved into modern racist notions in nonfiction contexts. The Mammy and Sapphire stereotypes, based on depictions of Black women in film, emasculating their husbands, perpetuating the idea that Black women are less submissive than other races, a shortcoming according to the ideals of femininity. Because of the lack of vulnerability displayed by media caricatures, Black women are seen as unsympathetic in news coverage. Stereotypes about women of color in media coverage influence American audiences, regardless of the journalist's intentions. These stereotypes are dehumanizing and planned biases present in real-life hiring situations, along with servicing the news. Although stereotypes interfere with financial employers' objectivity, journalism as a field would be enhanced by additional perspective on stories. Karen Hawkins, the Chicago Reader's co-editor-in-chief, said that the culture of newsrooms supports this idea that you have to be straight and white and middle class in order to be objective, that is the default position for viewing the world, and if you're not those things, then you're biased. Ideas surrounding objectivity are prevalent in U.S. newsrooms and are often based on the appearance of prospective hires. Ironically, the concept of an unbiased report is biased against those who have experienced racism, sexism, and other discrimination because they are assumed to harbor resentment when they are just as capable of presenting a story fairly as someone who is not. Examining race specifically, one study found that when 30 white journalists covered racial education disparities in Madison, Wisconsin, many of the reporters had trouble getting Black sources on the record and fell back on existing contacts with Black leaders or turned to Black sources who had contacted their newsrooms. These white journalists placed the burden on Black authorities outside of their organizations to provide the perspective that a Black employee of their own institution could have given. This could be avoided by hiring more journalists of color, and white employees could assist their coworkers in these stories to uplift reporting on communities of color while enriching their own knowledge. Eventually, a more diverse workforce could lead to less biased perspectives and reduced racial bias in media coverage. The news industry at large has failed to increase diversity in the past, even though individual programs have proven to do this successfully. Compiled survey data from 2018 is shown on the chart, and as you can see, the news industry has severely underrepresented women of color across all races. Networks have faced criticism for a lack of diversity for decades, but reports like these rarely show improvement. A report from the Women's Media Center in 2016 showed no change in the percentage of women overall in journalism and marginal changes for racial demographics. The neglect of these numbers means that programs to give voices to minority women journalists are crucial to spur change. One such program is the 50/50 Project, which originated with the BBC, which broadcast documenting the gender representation of contributors daily and tracking their progress towards hitting the goal of 50/50, that is equal representation for men and women monthly. The project was conceived and pioneered by a white man, and his method was that simple. After proving that the method worked for his own show, he presented it to his superiors and offered up the framework to any program that wanted to achieve 50/50 representation. And according to a Harvard Business Review article on the project, hundreds of news programs have gotten there since its 2017 conception. The ease of picking the best reporter for the job, regardless of gender, invalidates the excuses that news programs have made for their lack of diversity, and it is clear from the statistics that a change must be made. Unfortunately, hiring women and minorities into authority positions is often a calculated decision by an outlet to appeal to that demographic. Jill Filipovic, a writer for CNN, claims that when companies are in crisis due to poor male leadership, that's when they tend to put a woman at the head. And when the sinking ship inevitably goes down, the female leader shoulders the blame. Filipovic claims that media outlets such as Fox News will put a woman in a visible position while employees remain at the mercy of the same discrimination that existed before the change in leadership. Some claim that publicity stunts like these mean that companies with sexist history should not hire more women. While some company leaders certainly hired minorities in a public way to appear less biased, that is vastly different from hiring women of color in a legitimate attempt to find writers, and those who oppose diversity tend to conflate the two. In fact, if a female leader is empowered to make change, having someone who has experienced sexism at the head of the company could cause a shift in power dynamic of the entire network. As a UN article on intersectional feminism puts it, questioning power structures and speaking out against the root causes of inequalities are critical actions to building a future that leaves no one behind. Some organizations may need a change in leadership to disassemble their power structures, and others might have leaders already in place, ready to hire fresh faces. But changing the makeup of newsrooms, however it happens, can make a difference. Representations of women of color in the media can be improved, but its roots in stereotyping means that coverage must underscore their humanity at times just to counteract racist preconceptions. One example of racist stereotyping impacting coverage is known as missing white woman syndrome. Zach Summers, a sociologist from Northwestern University, compared the FBI missing persons database against the reporting of 4 news sources in 2013, finding that missing white women were much more likely than women of color to be the subject of news coverage relative to their proportions among missing persons. This idea appeals to stereotypes of white women as helpless, along with stereotypes of women of color as less submissive, and therefore less deserving of sympathy. These stereotypes are incredibly harmful because all victims of crime deserve to be covered in equal measure, and their families deserve equal opportunities for tips and justice for their loved ones. Conversely, coverage of newsmaking women of color often strives to represent them in depth. Representation of women of color must embrace their race and gender without letting it define their depiction. Serena Williams expressed in an interview with the New York Times that she understands that even when she's only focused on winning, she is still representing. The full article gives a spotlight to Williams' talent and acknowledges that her race cannot be separated from the public's perception of her, but that if race was not an issue, her achievements would speak for themselves. Claudia Rankine, the author of this article, is a Black woman, and her perspective lends her a deep view into the struggles and triumphs of Serena Williams, but any journalist should attempt to cover the full scope of the subject's humanity, regardless of their own race. Current media representations of women of color range from fleeting segments on victims of crime to in-depth profiles on newsmakers, and if institutional change is made, more accurate representation, such as the latter, is within reach. The change in media workforce will not be immediate, but it is possible and evidently necessary due to the history of stereotypes, outdated concepts of objectivity, opportunities for companies to change their dynamics, and potential to produce great representation. If newsrooms in the United States were more diverse, content would allow viewers to better connect with the stories of others regardless of race, and stereotypes could be combated with knowledge. Here's my works cited page. Thank you. What questions do you have?
I do have 2 questions for you. First up, how did you select the strategies you'd use to gather information when you were doing your research?
I selected strategies based on some recommendations from my peers and my teacher. The main search engine that I used to gather my sources was Scholar, because I was looking for studies, on social dynamics and race and gender. So I was able to find academic sources, and those allow me to have both statistical evidence and, something published by reputable authors.
All right. And what advice would you have for other researchers who consider this topic?
I would advise other researchers who consider this topic to go in with a closer focus, because I had an overarching goal during this research to really emphasize intersectionality and talk about race and gender, hopefully in a concurrent way. But other researchers probably should not attempt to do that as a paper, because I found that the scope of my question was slightly too big. And while I did try to cover aspect intersectionality, I would think that a focus on either race or gender would probably be more achievable.